Oh. Hello. Hi, I'm Dr. Scot Hutchison. Thanks for joining us tonight on Hutchison's Huddle for talking about embryo and egg and sperm cryopreservation. So hot topics these days, and very important. And a lot of you as patients have had something to do with this, and because we have been storing sperm for people who are deployed out of the country for quite a while so that their spouses can continue to attempt to conceive. And I think it would just be good to have a little bit of background on this topic. But before I forget, all of these are archived on our Facebook page, and our other huddles have some other really good patient care information in them. And you also get to see my co-conspirators, Drs. Aaron Sperry, Dr. Kevin Murphy, Dr. Alina Lackenpaul, and Dr. Sally Valenzuela, and they all have really good things to say as well. And by the way, they're all really good doctors, so if you're in the market for a general OBGYN, they are all outstanding. So going back in time, there was a push to try to figure out how to freeze blood to be able to help wounded service people overseas in World War II. That didn't quite work out super well, but a lot of that technology was then applied later on into other things. And it was interesting because some researchers had known for quite a while that some amphibian species, some that live up in the Arctic areas, will freeze solid completely for the winter and then come back to life and be able to continue their lifespan. So everyone wondered, how you can do that, because in most cells there's so much water in the cell that as you drop the temperature way down, the ice crystals in the cells will then expand outward, and they will actually spear open the cell membrane and destroy the cell. So these investigators said, these frogs, what they're doing is they're using an antifreeze, a sort of cryoprotectant that they drive out of the cells, the water, and then they can be then they can drop their temperature down and actually be frozen solid. So the first person to be able to successfully thaw and reuse sperm, then that was in 1953, and they went on to found a sperm bank. They had had a lot of work with cattle, freezing sperm for cattle, because if any of you know the livestock industry at all, some of these bulls are 1,500, 2,000 pounds, and they're pretty hard to move around, and some of them aren't so friendly. And so getting them to have sperm samples that you can collect and then freeze and then just send to the person trying to breed the cows was a whole lot more easily done. Anyway, then a fantastic biologist named Alan Trounson in 1983 actually used a day 3 embryo and was able to thaw it and transfer it. And that was the first human pregnancy that was reported using frozen embryos. Frozen eggs were a bigger challenge. And there was a pregnancy in 1986 from frozen eggs, but the pregnancy rates tended to be really, really super poor. And that's just because eggs are really, really fragile. Then these, but science moves on, and a lot of these investigators then went ahead and did more experiments, found out that if you raise the amount of that cryoprotectant that's in the solution, you can actually drive out even more water. And now those eggs will, as you drop the temperature down, will actually just become a solid. They become like glass. So the Latin word, I think, is vitreous for glass. So the new terminology is not just freezing, it's vitrifying. and that's actually a safer way to freeze embryos now too. So we freeze embryos or by vitrification as well. The use of those thawed embryos and thawed eggs and thawed sperm is the thought is that it's about as good or as good as the fresh gametes, now that the technique has really gotten quite good. We have had people come back after about 10 years and use embryos that were stored and have successful pregnancies. The oldest right now, I think, is an embryo that was stored for 24 years before it was thawed and transferred. But the big question is, people are always like, well, how long are they good for, you know? And the thought is right now that the limiting step is really the background radiation of the world. In that you have, there's always a little bit of radiation bouncing around. We have cosmic radiation that's always kind of bombarding us in small amounts. And I suppose we could, you know, maybe get lead tanks, but the embryos themselves, now that they're cryopreserved in this liquid nitrogen, there's no molecular motion. So the only thing that's going to damage them over time, other than taking them out and warming them up, is going to be radiation. And so the thought is that they probably are good for about 3,000 years. So a lot longer than most people are going to want to use them. But anyhow, so a lot of people, you know, recently in the news, one of the reasons we wanted to have this topic is there were a couple of centers around the country that had tanks that had somehow mysteriously warmed up and destroyed embryos. And so we've had a lot of patient calls asking, you know, how do you protect your embryos? How do you make sure that the embryos are going to stay frozen? And so let me talk about that a little bit. The embryo, so the media that once they're vitrified, these eggs or the eggs and the embryos and the sperm are frozen, then you can keep those samples in little tiny containers, you know, about 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters. And those are then placed in hanging straws that then can be hung into a column or a pool of liquid nitrogen. So the actual specimens that are in those little plastic vials take up very little space. And then they go into these big, what are essentially big thermos jugs. So just like a thermos, there's a double wall to the tank, and then the air in between those walls is pumped out to create a vacuum. That vacuum then doesn't, you know, there's not air molecules in there bouncing around, transferring heat to the liquid nitrogen from the outside world. So there's very little heat transfer. So the liquid nitrogen can stay liquid for long, long periods of time. So the tanks have a lid that is very thick and seals very tightly. And then on top of that, there's a lock and an alarm. And the alarm system is looking for any kind of breach of the tank or the level of liquid nitrogen dipping below a certain level. So when the alarm goes off, if there's no one here, the alarm then starts to sequentially call everybody who's involved with the practice. So if one person doesn't pick up, it moves on to the next. And you know, every few minutes then is calling to get somebody in here within a few minutes to attend to that particular tank. We have not had that happen. Tanks can fail over time because either the vacuum gets broken or the seal or the lid fails. But there's a protocol around here. It's a weekly deal where someone physically checks on them and makes sure that that all of the sensors are working correctly, because there is a big column of liquid nitrogen in the tank. We also have big storage liquid nitrogen tanks, and then we also have an emergency. We have a big emergency incubator that we could very rapidly, if we needed to offload specimens from a failing tank, that it could go into there. So anyway, so it's very safe. Which tank all the embryos or the sperm or the eggs are in is logged in log books, as to, you know, and so it's pretty easy to find them. The tanks themselves weigh, when they're full, about 80 to 100 pounds. They're movable. They're on casters, but like, I don't know if you guys are all probably too young to remember the Hurricane Katrina pictures of, or you weren't doing fertility at that time, but I remember seeing this one fertility center was flooded, and so they needed to evacuate their embryos, and they were literally loading them into a rowboat to take them to safety. Now, if you had to do that, you would really want to make sure that your tanks weren't dented, because again, it could mess up that vacuum seal, and so if if there was any suspicion of damage, if you had to do that, you would get rid of those tanks, get new ones. Anyway, what else? So that was that. Oh, and then there were a lot of so anyway, again, the egg, sperm, embryos, if they're good going into the tank, then we think that they're good for way longer than you'd want to use them, pushing into the 1,000-year mark. And I'm sure that somebody down the road will find embryos that were somebody else's from 100 years ago or 200 years ago and use them, and open up all kinds of weird ethical problems. That is also why most of these fertility centers, including ours, we want people to store embryos for as long as they're going to use them. But once a certain time reaches, like make a decision, like either use them and have more kids, or give them to somebody else, or tell us to discard them. Years ago, when people were kind of in the late 80s, when I was in training back in Baltimore, we were freezing a lot of day 2 embryos, and people were like, we don't know if these are going to be any good, but we'll go ahead and freeze them because maybe. Then over time, people started to realize, whoa, there's a lot of potential babies in these frozen embryos. But a lot of the patients had gotten the message that, maybe they're not really any good, so don't pin your hopes on them. And they had drifted off, lots of times moved away, didn't have a forwarding address, and so you couldn't really get a hold of them. And so there was this big crisis probably about 15 years ago where, all these fertility centers had thousands and thousands of frozen embryos, and then just had to, go to ethics boards or whatever and say, hey, what do we do with them? And the answer was usually, if you've made a good faith attempt to try to get a hold of these people, just go ahead and discard them. Because it's too ethically weird to give them to people without the couple's permission. So that leads us to how we do it. So around here, the storage fee for embryos is I think $360 for the year. Then at might be 500. Sorry, I know it's $360 to freeze a sperm sample, $200 to freeze the second sperm sample. But anyway, around about $500 a year. At 5 years, we kick it up to $1,000, because we really want people to either move those embryos to a long-term storage facility like Reproductive, or go ahead and use them, or give them to somebody else, or discard them. So anyway, so that's cost. Again, the frozen sperm thing is kind of a neat deal. We even have younger men who are like, I'm not ready to have kids yet, but I'd like to freeze sperm so that if I get to be 40 or above, I can have you guys use my frozen sperm from when I was 26, and that sperm would have a lower risk of siring a child with autism or bipolar disorder, because men at about age 40, their risks of fathering kids with bipolar disorder or autism start going up. It's not huge, but the risk of autism in the general population, autism spectrum disorder, is about 1 in 59. I mean, how you define that is kind of, it's a little iffy, like I look at the criteria, I'm like, yeah, I'm on that spectrum, so I'm not that much damaged goods. But anyway, it's 1 in 59 nominally. But if you're a guy and you're 40 to 45, the risk is probably about 1 in 40 something instead of 1 in 59. And with bipolar disorder, the background risk in the population is 3%. And so if you're a guy and you're 40, 45, your chance of having a kid with bipolar is probably then like 4% or whatever. When guys start getting, a lot older, like guys in their 60s have a much, much higher chance of having kids with bipolar disorder or autism. So it really starts to, probably go up by 2 or 3 fold. So anyway, so you can freeze sperm and keep it frozen indefinitely. There's a lot of questions that people have about frozen embryo transfers versus fresh embryo transfers. For those of you who have any experience with IVF stuff, you've probably heard about both of those things. Originally, IVF was all fresh, so people didn't know how to figure this stuff out for frozen, and so you got all the embryos, you took out all the eggs you could, you fertilized them all up, then you put them all back in the uterus and you hope for the best. And it was very inefficient process and very risky because pregnancy rates were super low. But if you did get pregnant, then you sat there biting your nails, wondering if you were going to have a set of quadruplets or something. So then, time marches on and we all have to collect our data for the Centers for Disease Control. And then they pool that data to try to get an idea about like trends, as to what's going on. And about 3-4 years ago, Centers for Disease Control said, hey, look, we have run through this data and there is a big difference between the length of the pregnancy with frozen embryo transfers versus fresh embryo transfers. And you'd think that, the less manipulation that you would do, the better it would be for the pregnancy. Like, everyone assumed, you're transferring fresh, it's got to be better than doing frozen. Well, it turns out that transferring embryos fresh cuts about 2.5 weeks off the duration of the pregnancy. And as the high-risk OBs always tell people, every day in the 3rd trimester is brain cells. So it's not huge, but it's enough that it really could affect the whole health and outcome of the baby. So some animal studies were done, and it turns out that the hormonal environment of IVF cycles, when you're doing a fresh cycle, you're taking a lot of follicle stimulating hormone to make a lot of eggs, but each one of those eggs is in a follicle, and each follicle makes estrogen, and that super high estrogen level that starts to climb up starts to affect the uterine lining in a way. And so these researchers, when they looked at animals that they had gotten pregnant, and then they would take out the uterus and they would section through it and look at how the placenta implanted, fresh embryo transfers caused far less invasion and breadth of expansion of the placenta in the mother's uterus. So then they looked at frozen embryo transfers, and the reverse is the truth, that you get a much better placenta, much deeper, much broader base of implantation. The downside to that is that with that really super good placenta, some of them don't want to shake loose as easily. So there's potentially more bleeding at the time of delivery. That's dangerous for the mom, but in the balance, I think most of our patients are like, hey, I really want the best thing for my baby. So that's kind of where things are. I would say the IVF meeting that I got back from a couple of weeks ago, I would say last year it was when they polled the audience, it was probably about 65-70% had switched to what's called freeze all, where you freeze all of the embryos and transfer later. And this time I would say it was about 95%. So that is the future, because it just is. It's a safer kind of a thing. Of course, it does mean that your lab has to be able to freeze, and they have to be able to warm well and all that kind of stuff. And it just, those are extra steps. Labs that are in, remote locations around the world where you're trying to just shoestring it to make it as affordable as possible, like maybe you can't do that. But on the other hand, do you really want to be having a baby born early out, in the bush somewhere where there's really no good medical care? So, so no good answer for that. I don't think. But anyway, so that is sperm, egg, and embryo cryopreservation. And if you have any other questions or calls, feel free to call our office, and we'll let you know. Oh, and if you're wondering, yes, you can transfer embryos all around. Some people, I mean, we'll follow people who have embryos stored elsewhere, and if they've had good experiences with a center back east or in LA or whatever, we just follow them. They go back there. Other people want to have their embryos shipped in or moved to a different center. There are different companies actually do that work. They don't charge a phenomenal amount. Here in town, if people are moving embryos around, it's about $300 because we're just charging to fill up the tank with the liquid nitrogen to take the embryos. And the liquid nitrogen has gotten a lot more expensive lately, but it's still not super pricey. And that's all. So let me see if anybody has any questions. But yeah, give us a call if you have any questions about embryo or egg or sperm freezing. And have a great night. Again, this is Dr. Scot Hutchison in Tucson, Arizona. Look up on our Facebook our other patient education discussions, and look out for the next one, which is coming up. Let me ask my collaborator here, Katrina Bakame. Katrina, when is the next one? So the next one is going to be on August 29th, and it's going to be on body mass index and fertility, because there's a lot of misperceptions about that. Turns out that just looking at people's weight is a very poor marker for reproductive potential, and so we gotta cover that because that's super, super important. Thank you all.